I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're standing on today, the Kaurna people, and elders past, present and future.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am going to talk about my presentation, which was part of my master's program, which was an exploration of narrative practices in a group sex therapy context, as opposed to a group sex therapy context. And I'm going to talk about what I learned, what my participants experienced to the best of my knowledge. And yeah, I'm really honoured to be sharing that with you today, so thank you for watching. So first of all, I'd just like to start off by giving you a little bit of a background, a bit of context to my work and the way that I work. And some of the assumptions that people make about my work is that I work with a lot of cases of sexual abuse, which I do work with some cases of sexual abuse, but not necessarily any more than any other therapist. This is also not really my area of interest. Instead, what I'm interested in is a social analysis of sex, of sexual cultures, and of dominant discourses that interfere with pleasure, connection, intimacy, and human relationships. So in my work as a sex therapist, I'm interested in what prevents everyday folks from talking about it as openly as they would talk about sharing recipes, for example. And I'm interested in what causes the silence and stigma around sex that leads to disconnection and all of the ailments that stem from that. Working as a sex and relationship therapist means that my work is very much about the topics that we can see here in this slide. Now, this is a map of the lands of sexual cultures by somebody called Franklin Veaux. This is not my map, but it really explains the territories that my clients and I will go to in our discussions around sex, sexuality and pleasure. And it's interesting that these nations, as it were, are things that many people shy away from, both professionals and lay people. Now, in my context, I'm in many ways serving the very same community that I am part of. I am, like all of us, a sexual person with sexual needs, and I don't have the relative distance that a lot of us have in working in a context outside of our own community or outside of our own lives. So in speaking of my clients today, it's important to recognize that I'm also actually speaking about myself. I'm speaking about my own struggles and my ongoing experiences of being stigmatized for who I am and what I do and the work that I do. And in fact, that it is part of my work with groups of folk around this stuff who often see me as other. That this is part of my resilient act of resistance, which gives my life its colour and its purpose and its passion. So like all of our clients, the clients that I see are not actually unwell. However, many of them have problems. And they are in fact, like all of us, living in the same country with the same experiences of stigma that are often associated with sex and sexuality. But culturally, in most parts of the world, the stigma around sex isn't seen as a problem. It's seen as a moral value. It's seen as something virtuous that we are encouraged to uphold, and there are consequences if we transgress or step outside the place that we are supposed to be. We know this because there are few places that we can discuss sex and pleasure as distinct from identity and gender, where we can discuss these things openly and meaningfully. We may think that we are exempt from these discussions if we're married, if we're partnered, if we're heterosexual, or even if we don't like sex or we don't want sex. But we all still live together in the same communities, in the same cultures, and in many cases it's a very, very hypersexualized culture that doesn't know how to talk about the very thing that is the muse of advertising, of pop music, of fashion and pop culture. There is a deafening silence around these things, and that is what I am interested in. The problem is unique in that it does affect all of us, but it's the degree to which the stigma affects us that causes the strain. When I was considering this innovation, I thought, what can I do that was different? I was drawn to the examples of group work that we had been reading during the master's program, but I thought, I can't do that. Who would come to group sex therapy? So I spoke to David, one of my teachers. Do I have to run a group? I asked him. Please don't make me run a group. He said, no, you don't have to run a group. So I decided I would run a group. Me being me, once the thought was in my head, I just couldn't get rid of it. And I'm not the type to shy away from a challenge, and so the reason that I decided to run a group, as distinct from working with individuals and couples, which is most of the work that I do as a therapist, involves working in private practice means few opportunities for group work for me in any context, and I wanted to challenge myself to see if it was possible. It also ignited my revolutionary spirit, because my understanding was, in the world of narrative therapy, nothing like this had been done before. It challenged my beliefs about what could be done, and it was a wonderful opportunity to practice skills and learn, it was a wonderful opportunity to practice my skills that I had learnt from the readings and texts and coursework that I may not get the chance to utilise if I had been working in any other way. I was afraid of running the group and how the stigma still affects me. My fear was that it won't work, or could it even be done? In acknowledging my privilege as the expert who people look up to, if I decide that it can't be done, am I then denying the participants the opportunity to have the experience for themselves? I had attempted group therapy in the past, but there was, and there still is, a lot of fear around disclosure, around who would be there and how the group would run, especially when we're dealing with a taboo topic like human sexuality. Beale's references to liberation and personal agency sparked my enthusiasm. In my work, so much of what creates the changes we seek come down to liberation from the silence around sex and personal agency to know what we need to know and how we need it. For most of us, these insider knowledges, our erotic knowledges, our intimate knowledges, are known to all of us, just like all of our other knowledges. But we just need the right context to allow them the space to come out. So this inspired me to consider what kind of an environment would be necessary to begin such sharing. The participants in my group were all voluntary. They were willing and not paying for the service. They all had English as a first language and were Western educated and low income earners. The way that I found them was by putting an ad on Facebook, and they were all eager to come along. And the conditions that I stipulated was that they needed to be free on Wednesday mornings and able to navigate stairs, because the building that I work in has a set of stairs. So many people responded, but in the end, 4 were able to commit, and they were 3 cisgendered women and 1 cisgendered man, all of whom identify as white. I was very mindful of creating safety, both physical and emotional, before we got down to it. Because historically, sex stories, when they are shared in public, are steeped in shame, they're steeped in abuse, and they're steeped in pain. And these are the contexts that we are most familiar with discussing sex in. And rarely, if ever, do we hear discussions of sexuality that are in a context of permission or pleasure. And this almost never happens without an element of performance to it. So people who do discuss sexuality have historically been labelled perverts, a word which is now being reclaimed by pockets of the queer community in a long tradition of pathologising everything from homosexuality to sex work to non-monogamy and even nymphomania. Anything basically that sat outside of the hetero-monogamous marital union. So for me, taking a sex-positive view allows for much more diversity in the conversations that we have. I explained to the participants what I was doing and what I was going to facilitate, and that it was as new to me as it was to them, that we were effectively all part of an experiment, that they could leave at any time, and they had the option to not participate in any of the activities that I invited them to do. Now, I'm also aware that these are privileges of folk who are able to exercise some agency around their participation. One of my privileges is that I hold a fairly solid position of authority in the sex therapy world in Australia. My work is known, I'm published, and I'm trusted, especially by the alternative community, as a figurehead that holds them in high regard. I didn't need to work as hard as others in my position to earn my participants' trust in this particular context. They all volunteered to be part of the program because they knew me and they wanted to participate. So we met every week for 15 weeks for 1.5 hours each time. In the first session, we used Tree of Life practices just to get to know each other, to focus on our capacity to self-reflect, and rather than jumping straight into standard sex therapy tropes about how to have perfect sex and other such unhelpful myths that a lot of people think are what we do in sex therapy. In weeks 2 through to 5, we created a space to allow the participants an opportunity to share our problems, the way that we have experienced sex and what it was that brought them to the group in the first place. And I set this up in the context of what would be familiar in a narrative sense of outsider witnessing. I invited them to share what was their experience of sex and relationship, what was hurting, what was distressing, and what motivated them to come, and how long they had been feeling the way they do. So the participants had the opportunity to provide reflections of what caught their attention, and also were invited to respond with individual letters. Many of them choose to do so. The information in these feedback sessions and in the individual letters became increasingly valuable in subsequent weeks. I was inspired by Denborough's video talking about receivers of social suffering. The thing about social suffering around sex is that it affects all of us. Whether we have it or not, we live in a culture obsessed with it, but really not willing to talk about it. It's fair to say that most of us carry the burden of having our sexuality reduced to something of little value, little importance, or shut down for fear of being too dirty, too much, or even not enough. I want to show you now an image of the Charmed Circle, which is from a book called Rewriting the Rules by Meg John Barker. And what the Charmed Circle does is it highlights the groups who are sexually privileged or valued in Western culture. And it's not dissimilar to the slide I just showed you previously, the sexual hierarchy pyramid. These are just ideas. These are not facts or set in stone, but just a way of helping you or inviting you to look at sexuality differently, to consider where you might sit in the circle. So those in the inner circle are the charmed ones, the privileged ones, the ones who are having what we would probably call normal sex. And then the folks who sit in the outer circle have less privilege around their sexuality and around their sex practices in particular, because these are something that we don't often get to talk about. And part of that is what causes the silence, that we are afraid because certain sex acts are privileged with the ability to have discussions, primarily intercourse, penis in vagina intercourse, whereas penis into anus intercourse, for example, is not privileged, and we're not allowed to talk about that. So that's the sort of stuff that I'm interested in. And the reason that I think that this model is particularly helpful is because it helps give us an illustration of some of Hutton's work around reversing the normalizing gaze, that if we were to flip this circle around, what might happen, just to consider how the privileges would affect different people in different ways. In our group sessions, the participants regularly noted that collective awareness brings liberation from shame and inadequacy. Hansacker's account of clients sparking courage in each other has been evident in our group as well. So much so that one participant joked and said, "Yeah, we should get certificates for this." "Okay," I responded, and she thought I was joking. From weeks 6 through to 8, we had developed an ease of conversation, and I invited participants back to the trees, but this time we created sex trees. Now, the sex trees are based on the Tree of Life model, and we had the opportunity to reflect on our skills, our knowledges and competencies around sex, pleasure and relationship. So the sex trees were based on the same format, and I'm just going to share with you how I structured the qualities of the different parts of the tree slightly differently. So the roots were learnings about sexuality: who, what, when, where and how. Even if you learnt things about sex that were originally unhelpful, how have those unhelpful learnings led you to know more about what are some of the more deeply held values about sexuality now? The ground represents sexuality at present. What grounds you in your sex life was the main question that I asked. Things like identity, relationships, community, social media supports, interest groups, clubs, authors, teachers, therapists, blogs, podcasts, etc. Anything that helped them feel more connected to their day-to-day practices of sex and sexuality, whatever that looked like for them. The trunk referenced skills and competencies. What have you learnt about your skills as a partner, your offerings, your insights, and how do they compare to when we first came together as a group? How did the feedback from the outsider witnessing process and from your friends and partners change as we've been talking about this more over the last 6 weeks? The branches represented hopes and dreams. What do you want from your sex life? Where would you like your sex life to go? And what options could be available to you now that you know that you're not alone in your feelings around sex and relationships? And this theme was especially relevant to the group that I was working with. And finally, the leaves represented people who have influenced your understanding of sexuality. So these could be other members of the group that we were in, authors, teachers, again, workshop facilitators, bloggers, artists, friends. Who has had an impact on your knowledge of sexuality and continuing to change? And the fruits are the gifts that you have received from people. They may be physical gifts or words of praise, appreciation, and kindness. Reauthoring stories in a sex therapy context is challenging. After all, dominant discourses around contemporary human sexual relations tend to be narrow and fixed and deeply personal. So when the themes of success, freedom and feminism intersect with desire and eroticism, the stories that people tend to hold as truths become challenged. This was the beauty of working with the sex trees, as the structure of each part allowed time for reflection on the aspects of human sexuality that are traditionally seen as problematic or harder to access, especially because they're often under a cloud of shame. From weeks 9 to 14, we started to practice collective externalizing and two-way learning with insider knowledges. I was interested in post-sex trees. What do we now know about sex, intimacy, connection, and pleasure? And how could two-way learning offer an opportunity for double story development? I was curious to know what was different, what was present, what wasn't present, and what did its absence make possible? And with this knowledge that you have now, is there anything that the problem has lost or reduced? Epstein speaks of people's desire for an escape from the pain that they associate with being defective or abnormal, which in a sex context has created a multi-million-dollar industry from things like Viagra, for example. Clients will often ask me some version of why am I like this, or am I normal, when experiencing some kind of erotic emergence that doesn't make sense to them based on dominant narratives of how sex should be. But where do we learn this, and who decides what makes for good sex? The power of the collective in externalizing offers a source of solace and stability, especially if one's sexual identity or sexual self-understanding is emerging, just coming through in a new lens. In our group, collective externalizing highlighted not only stigma as a theme, but also rejection as a theme, something that everyone in the group had experienced in response to their sexuality. And so in getting to know rejection more, I posed these questions. What is rejection's purpose? What makes rejection retreat? What has been helpful in managing rejection in the past? What does rejection stop us from having? What are we being rejected from? What is valuable to us about X, the thing we're being rejected from, that makes us want to be there? What parts of X do we then hold valuable? What does X offer you? What is attractive or appealing about X? And what would a community that also cherished X look like? Questioning dominant discourse in the group generated powerful conversation. When one spoke of a sparkling moment that had changed the course of their week, the others would often go back to their sex trees and add on a new branch or a new leaf or a new fruit, or sometimes even a new aspect of the trunk that they didn't realize was there until they were inspired by another's sparkling moment. Nassim notes the power of retelling's effect in his group therapy sessions, and as participants get to hear the images and sensations that others in the group were moved by, this was allowing a different and broader experience of the story. For one of our group, the tendency to revert back to the problem-saturated story was alluring, and they often attended sessions feeling a little bit weighed down until they remembered themselves into the group or got remembered back into the culture of the group dynamic, which then shifted the emphasis from the personal to the collective and back again. Meyerhoff describes this when she says, "They show themselves to themselves by rendering visible the actual desired truths about themselves. Through this process, their preferred stories started to emerge."
I still feel emotionally confused about sex. Sex feels like going to gym. It works for me if I'm consistent in my inquiry with it. In the group, I felt more comfortable, that I was not alone, more willing to open up. Society has got us like cattle. So many have had sexual trauma, but it gets suppressed. It, the group, has been enriching my understanding of sexuality. It's made me braver to talk about the sex that I want to be having. It, the talk, went badly. I want to not let things go. That's not okay with me. It's a real act of resistance against patriarchy. Talking about things openly is really important to me, but some people don't want to do that. Everyone here was willing to have a crack at it. How do we get everyone to the table to do this? What keeps us separated? Fear, misunderstanding, lack of information about similarity. We're all very different, but with similar drives.
What has shifted through this process? Similarities. Our issues are not the same, but they have a basis that's common to all of us. We haven't taken care of ourselves enough. The ability to overcome has actually been there for everybody. Sharing information has lessened the intensity and made me feel more common. It's given me the courage to speak about these things in a relationship, and that it's okay to ask for what I want. I have spent a lot of my life keeping things to myself because I wasn't able to ask for it. Too many negative experiences in the past. I'm willing to work with it rather than fight it. The thought of coming here absolutely terrified me. I'm surprised that I came. It's not been probing, and it's been organic, small and intimate. I feel safe. Fighting control is hard. Sharing in the group was confronting. and the similarities are scary. I thought I was unique, that no one else had these problems. It's given me a wider perspective, and it's not as terrifying as it used to be. The negatives tend to hurt, and they are more remembered. Society doesn't harp or focus on positives. It becomes difficult to find the good bits when they do come up. Society says, don't talk about sex. You know, it's the Christianity thing, the rules and the secrecy. Don't talk. Silence equals power, but it's not our power. It was a challenge being the token male. I wasn't certain, but my expression was helped by hearing others speak. It was less uncomfortable telling my story. It gave me the courage by hearing others' stories. Finally, in preparation for the end of the program, I invited participants to reflect on what they would like on their certificates. Our certificates, they giggled and questioned. And together we pondered these categories, and they formed the basis of what went on to their individualized certificates. What do you now celebrate about your sexuality? What is still a work in progress? And what skills and knowledges have you learnt from the group experience? And these are the results.